The girl with the red mark in her palm. Old Madame Chen was chopping wood in the forest when she suddenly heard a rustling sound coming from a hollow at the base of a tree. She set down her hatchet and reached into the hole, digging carefully until her fingers touched a cloth bundle. Layer by layer, she unwrapped it, only to find a baby girl inside. The little girl had a wrinkled face, wide open eyes, and a bright red mole in the center of her palm. She neither cried nor fussed. She simply stared up at Madame Chen in silence. Madame Chen's heart softened at once. She wrapped the baby in her arms and carried her home. Back at the house, she laid the little girl on the heated brick bed and struck a flint to light the kerosene lamp. The dim yellow light spread across the room, making the red mole in the baby's palm glow even brighter, like a tiny blood-red bean. Madame Chen looked at the soft little child in her arms, and warmth rose in her chest. She scraped together the last bit of cornmeal from the bottom of her jar, boiled some hot water, and mixed it into a thin paste. Spoonful by spoonful, she fed it to the baby. The baby opened her tiny mouth obediently, swallowing every bite. Once she was full, she wrapped her little hand around Madame Chen's rough finger and drifted peacefully to sleep. The next morning, before dawn had fully broken, Madame Chen had to head into the mountains to gather firewood. Worried about leaving the baby alone, she carried her next door and asked Old Woman Wang to watch her for the morning. Old Woman Wang was known for gossiping. She loved poking into other people's business. The moment she saw the unfamiliar baby, she lifted the rough cloth covering the child and noticed the red mole in the center of her palm. At once, Wang recoiled in fear, taking 2 quick steps backward. Her face turned pale. Lowering her voice, she warned Madame Chen that a child born with a red mark in her palm carried evil energy. She called the baby a bringer of disaster and said that if she stayed in the village, sooner or later she would bring ruin upon them all. She urged Madame Chen to throw the baby away immediately before she brought misfortune upon herself and the whole village. Madame Chen frowned, but said nothing. Instead, she simply handed Wang a coarse bowl filled with leftover corn porridge and said that she only needed help for the morning. Once she returned from chopping wood, she would repay her with a full bundle of dry firewood. Then, gripping her hatchet tightly, Madame Chen hurried toward the mountain. But in her heart, she had already made up her mind. No matter where this child came from, now that fate had placed her in her path, she would never abandon her. That day, what should have been an ordinary trip into the mountains turned into something unexpected. While digging near the roots of an old tree, Madame Chen unearthed a cluster of wild mountain ginseng of remarkable quality. She carried it down to town and sold it at the herbal medicine shop, receiving a generous amount of silver in return, enough for her and the little girl to live steadily for quite some time. Holding the silver in her hands and looking down at the sleeping baby in her arms, Madame Chen suddenly understood. This child was no disaster. She was a blessing. So right then and there, she gave the girl a name, Xiulian. She hoped the child would grow up like a green lotus in the mountains, pure, graceful, and safe. From the time she was little, Xiulian was gentle and unusually healthy. She grew much faster than ordinary children. By 3 months old, she could sit steadily. By 7 months, she was crawling all over the floor. Just after turning 1, she was already toddling around the yard on her short little legs, following behind Madame Chen. By the age of 2, she liked squatting in the dirt by the front gate, either staring quietly at insects on the ground or gazing out toward the river beyond the village. She was always calm and silent, never noisy, never troublesome. But the villagers could never forget the red mark in her palm. Whispers began to spread. Some people would go out of their way to avoid Xiulian, afraid that merely getting too close might bring bad luck. Others huddled together and whispered that she was some kind of spirit reborn. Some even hinted to Madame Chen that she should send the child away before disaster struck. Madame Chen never argued with them. She simply held Xiulian tighter in her arms and protected her more fiercely. To her, Xiulian was never a cursed child. She was a gift from heaven. Whenever people gossiped, Madame Chen would only say one thing: "This child has no father, no mother, and nowhere else to go. I am raising her. What does that have to do with anyone else? If misfortune comes, I will bear it alone. I will never let it harm this village. Madame Chen was stubborn by nature. Once she made up her mind, no one could change it. So no matter how much the villagers talked, she continued to treasure Xiulian as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Even when food was scarce, she always made sure Xiulian ate first. When clothes were torn, Xiulian's were mended before her own. Their life was poor, but it was warm. By the time Xiulian turned 6, a summer of endless rain descended upon the land. It rained for more than 10 straight days, and the river began to swell. The once gentle waters became fierce and violent. One wave after another slammed against the village embankment with thunderous force. The riverbank had already been neglected for years. It could not withstand the relentless pounding. Before long, a massive crack split open in the levee and floodwater surged toward the village. Panic broke out. The villagers rushed to the embankment carrying hose and sandbags, desperately trying to block the breach. But the flood was too strong. Every sandbag they threw in was swept away instantly. The houses were about to be swallowed. The fields were drowning. The crops would soon rot where they stood. The villagers stomped their feet in despair, helpless as the flood crept closer and closer. Then, in that desperate moment, little Xiulian suddenly broke free from Madame Chen's hand and ran toward the breach in the embankment. Her tiny body stood before the raging flood without the slightest fear. She lifted her little hand, the one with the red mark in its palm, and gently raised it toward the torrent. In an instant, the wild waters calmed. The towering waves slowly sank back down. The rushing current weakened and, as if obeying her command, bent away from the broken embankment instead of surging through it. The villagers stood frozen in shock. One by one, the farming tools slipped from their hands and fell to the ground. Xiulian continued moving her small hand through the air. The loosened mud around the levee began to gather on its own, slowly sealing the crack. The crumbling embankment, which had been on the verge of collapse, suddenly stood firm again. Within moments, the flood had retreated. The river returned to its calm, peaceful flow. The homes were saved, the grain fields were saved, the whole village was saved. When the villagers finally came back to their senses, the way they looked at Xiulian had changed completely. All their suspicion, fear, and cruel gossip vanished. What remained was only gratitude and awe. No one had ever imagined that the little girl they once called a bringer of disaster would possess such power over water and single-handedly save the entire village. From that day on, no one ever dared call Xiulian a curse again. Now, they called her the village's blessed child. But misfortune never comes alone. No sooner had the flood been stopped than the heavens turned cruel in another way. For 100 straight days, not a single drop of rain fell. The blazing sun scorched the earth until the ground split with deep cracks. Crops in the fields wilted and curled. Even the village wells began to dry up. To fetch water, people had to walk more than 10 miles into the mountains. The crops were on the verge of dying. The autumn harvest looked hopeless. Day after day, the villagers prayed to the sky for rain, but no rain came. Life became unbearably hard. Madame Chen sat on the doorstep, sighing heavily. Xiulian crouched silently in the yard, staring at the cracked earth, then looking out toward the dry fields beyond the village. Several days later, she tugged on Madame Chen's hand and led her to a barren patch of land west of the village. She pointed to one dry spot and motioned for Madame Chen to dig. Though confused, Madame Chen trusted her. She picked up a hoe and began to dig. At first, the earth was dry and hard, but after only a couple of feet, the soil turned damp. She dug deeper. Then suddenly, with one final strike of the hoe, an underground spring burst upward from the earth. Clear, sweet water poured out in a steady stream. It was enough to irrigate the village fields and enough to supply drinking water for everyone. Only then did the villagers realize that Xiulian could sense underground water veins and knew where hidden streams flowed beneath the earth. In a matter of moments, she had solved the village's 100-day drought. The villagers rushed to the site, cupping the fresh spring water in their hands and crying tears of joy. They thanked Xiulian over and over. The village chief personally brought sacks of grain to Madame Chen's home to repay Xiulian for saving them once again. Even old woman Wang, who had once called Xiulian a curse, came over red-faced with shame. She held Xiulian's hand and stuffed a piece of candy into her pocket, apologizing awkwardly and admitting she had been foolish to mistake a blessing for a disaster. Xiulian simply accepted the candy, chewing it with a small smile, still as quiet and gentle as ever. From then on, the entire village changed the way they treated her. The village children started following Xiulian around, playing with her by the riverbanks and in the fields. The adults often asked her whether the river would rise or whether the weather would change before they went fishing or farming. And every single time, Xiulian's predictions were exactly right. Under her quiet watch, the village suffered fewer floods. The harvests grew better year after year. Fishermen returned with fuller catches. Life slowly became more prosperous. Seeing how intelligent Xiulian was, Madame Chen began teaching her everything she knew about sensing danger, reading the sky, and understanding the moods of water. Xiulian was gifted beyond belief. She only needed to learn something once to remember it forever. Not only that, but she could understand deeper truths from a single lesson and refine those skills even further on her own. Bit by bit, she came to understand the true nature of the river and how to protect the people from disaster. Time passed, and by the time Xiulian was 8, another terrible event struck the village. One day, several children went together to the river to catch fish. The surface of the water looked calm, but beneath it, a dangerous current was moving unseen. One of the children slipped and fell. Then another. In an instant, several of them were swept away by the rushing current. Their parents ran screaming to the riverbank, crying so hard their voices broke. The villagers arrived with bamboo poles and ropes, but the current was too strong. No one could get close enough to help. Everyone could only watch in horror. Then Xiulian ran to the riverbank and leapt straight into the water. Once in the river, she moved as if she were walking on solid ground. The water itself seemed to become her arms and legs, carrying her swiftly forward. In no time at all, she caught up to the children being dragged away. With one hand, she held them safely against her. With the other, she guided the current, steering them around rocks and away from dangerous eddies. One by one, she brought every child safely back to shore. When she climbed out of the river, only the tips of her hair were damp. Her breathing was calm and steady, and she showed no sign of exhaustion. The parents of the rescued children fell to their knees before Xiulian and Madame Chen, tears streaming down their faces as they thanked them over and over. Xiulian only shook her head lightly, took Madame Chen's hand, and walked home as if she had merely done something ordinary. After that, Xiulian's name spread far beyond the village. People in nearby villages all heard of the mysterious girl by the river, who was born with a red mark in her palm, who could command the waters, and who protected everyone around her with wisdom and kindness. A year later, a wandering Taoist priest came to the village. He wore a plain robe and carried a whisk in his hand. He had the bearing of a man who had stepped out of the mountains themselves. He claimed he had come from a distant sacred peak and had traveled here after hearing about Xiulian. When he met Madame Chen, he bowed respectfully and spoke with sincerity. He said, Xiulian was no ordinary child. Her destiny was extraordinary, and her spiritual gifts were rare beyond measure. To leave her in a poor riverside village farming and fishing would be to waste a heavenly talent. If she followed him into the mountains to cultivate the way, he said, she could one day attain the highest spiritual path and ascend far beyond the ordinary world. The villagers all heard his words. Though they hated the thought of losing Xiulian, many believed the priest was right. A child like her deserved a greater destiny than hardship and muddy fields. They all encouraged her to go. Madame Chen listened in silence. Her heart was torn in two. She was proud of the child she had raised, but the thought of losing her was unbearable. At last, she gently stroked Xiulian's hair, her eyes filling with tears, and told her that if she wanted to leave, she would not stop her. Go, if your heart wants to go, she said softly. I will wait for you here. Even if I never see you again, as long as you live well, I will be at peace. But Xiulian threw her arms around Madame Chen's legs and buried her face in her adoptive mother's chest. She shook her head firmly. She said she would go nowhere. She would stay with her mother. She would stay with her home. She would stay with the villagers she loved. The Taoist priest looked at the stubborn child, then at the deep bond between mother and daughter, and let out a long sigh. He understood that this was not something he could force. So he bowed deeply to both of them and left, never bringing up the matter again. From that day on, Xiulian devoted herself even more to staying by Madame Chen's side. She chopped wood with her, farmed with her, mended clothes with her, and in her spare time walked along the riverbanks, sensing the movement of water veins beneath the earth. Whenever danger approached, she warned the villagers in advance. During drought, she guided hidden water to the fields. She taught the younger villagers everything she knew: how to read the river, how to predict danger, how to survive by the water, and how to find underground currents in times of need. She held nothing back. All she wanted was for the villagers to live in peace. Madame Chen watched Xiulian grow into such a selfless and capable young girl, and deep in her heart, she knew she had made the right choice all those years ago. This child had never been a curse. She had always been a blessing. But time spares no one. Madame Chen was growing old, and years of hardship had worn down her body. By the time Xiulian was 12, she fell seriously ill and became bedridden. Xiulian was heartbroken. She stayed by her mother's bedside day and night without leaving for even a moment. She carried Madame Chen on her back to visit doctors in neighboring villages, fetched medicine, boiled herbs, fed her by hand, brought her tea, washed her, and cared for her every need. She never once complained. The villagers, remembering all Xiulian had done for them, came to help as well. Some brought warm rice porridge, some brought eggs and simple food, some helped clean the yard or tend the fields. They took turns checking in on Madame Chen, and the entire village felt warmer than it ever had before. All the old fear and distance were gone. At the very end of her life, Madame Chen held Xiulian's hand. Her eyes had grown cloudy, but they were still full of love. In a soft voice, she gave Xiulian one final piece of wisdom. In this life, she said, "It does not matter how great your abilities are. It does not matter how much money you have. The most precious thing a person can possess is a kind heart. No matter how others see you, and no matter how unusual you may be, hold fast to your true heart. Be kind. Protect the village. Help the people around you live honest and peaceful lives. That is the best destiny anyone could ever ask for." Xiulian lay by the bedside, tears running down her face, and nodded again and again, engraving every word into her heart. A few days later, Madame Chen passed away peacefully. Following the village customs, Xiulian arranged her adoptive mother's funeral with her own hands. She wore mourning clothes and personally sent Madame Chen on her final journey. Though her cries were choked with grief, she held herself together, making sure everything was done properly so her mother could leave this world without worry. After Madame Chen was gone, Xiulian did not leave River Village. She stayed. She remained in the old mud brick house her mother had left behind. She stayed with the villagers. She stayed beside the endless river that flowed before her door. She inherited Madame Chen's fields and worked them diligently every day, never lazy, never careless. When she was not farming, she stayed by the river, watching for signs of danger and warning the villagers at the first hint of change. Because of her vigilance, no great flood ever struck the village again. She passed on everything Madame Chen had taught her, along with the water-guiding and danger-avoiding methods she had discovered herself. She taught the fishermen how to stay safe on the river. She taught the farmers how to use the water veins to nourish their crops. She taught everyone how to live alongside the river without being destroyed by it. Under Xiulian's care, both farming and fishing flourished more than ever. She spent her entire life in River Village, giving all of herself to the land and to the people who lived there. She was gentle by nature and generous to all. Whenever a family was in trouble, she helped. Whenever disaster struck, she stepped forward. She became the village's most trusted guardian, deeply respected and dearly loved by everyone. Many years later, Xiulian too began to grow old. But even in old age, she still went to the river every day, checking the water, reminding the younger generations to guard the river well and protect the village. The younger villagers never forgot her kindness or the knowledge she had passed down. Generation after generation, they continued the methods she had taught them, using the river wisely and avoiding danger. And because of Xiulian's lifelong protection, River Village prospered year after year. The weather was favorable, the harvests were rich, and the people lived peaceful, abundant lives. Sometimes travelers from distant places would pass through the village and hear Xiulian's story. Many would shake their heads in pity and say that if she had followed the wandering Taoist priest into the mountains long ago, she might have become a great immortal or spiritual master, instead of spending her life laboring beside a river in a poor village. But whenever Xiulian heard such things, she only smiled softly. Her eyes were calm and warm. She would simply say that she had never regretted her choice, because to her, River Village was her home. Madame Chen was her mother, and the villagers were her family. To remain with the people she loved, to protect her home, and to use her gifts so that others could live safe and peaceful lives, that, to her, was far greater than becoming any immortal or master could ever be.